The porcelain mug cracked under pressure, but the real break happened when he called me useless. Now, the city is watching as I prove him fatally wrong. The porcelain mug cracked under the pressure of my thumb, a hairline fracture spider webbing across the delicate blue willow pattern. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. The sound, though slight, was the loudest thing in the sterile, echoing expanse of our dining room. Across the polished mahogany, Mark leaned back in his expensive leather chair, the picture of self-satisfied authority. His silk tie, perfectly knotted, seemed to mock the fraying edges of my own composure. "So, that's it, Eleanor," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth he usually reserved for closing multi-million-dollar deals. This tone, clinical, final, was reserved for termination, not just of a contract, but of a life partnership we'd spent 15 years building, brick by agonizing brick. I stared at the condensation dripping from my iced water glass. It felt like hours since he'd delivered the payload, though the clock on the mantelpiece probably registered only 5 minutes. Useless, that was the word, not incompatible. Not that our paths diverged. Useless. "I've already spoken to Henderson," Mark continued, adjusting the cufflink etched with his initials. "He's drafting the papers. You can stay in the penthouse until the settlement is finalized. Just try not to clutter the place." My uselessness, apparently, was quantifiable. I had given up my fledgling career in museum curation when he'd received the promotion that required moving us across the country. I had managed the homes, hosted the functions, smoothed the ruffled feathers of his associates, and ensured that Mark's ascent remained entirely unimpeded by domestic inconvenience. I was the flawless backdrop, the silent, elegant support structure, until, I suppose, the structure started to show its own weight. "Eleanor, are you even listening?" His tone sharpened, laced with impatience. I finally looked up. My eyes, usually described by society columnists as warm hazel, felt cold, distant, like stones at the bottom of a deep well. I opened my mouth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the heavy silver spoon across the room and watch it embed itself in the antique wallpaper. I wanted to remind him of the night he'd nearly lost everything on the Peterson deal and how I hadn't slept for 72 hours, quietly feeding him data points gleaned from old university texts because he had forgotten to prepare the counter-strategy. But nothing came out. The silence was too ingrained. A lifetime of being the quiet wife had cemented my throat shut. I just sat there, nodding almost imperceptibly, absorbing the insult, letting the poison of his dismissal settle deep into my bones. Mark sighed, a sound of immense relief that he didn't have to deal with hysterics. "Good. I knew you'd be rational about this. I need you gone by the end of the month. Try to keep the optics clean, Elle. My board is already watching." He stood up, smoothing his jacket. He didn't kiss me goodbye. He rarely did anymore. He walked towards the French doors leading to the balcony, presumably to take a call congratulating him on his latest success, or perhaps finalizing the dissolution of his marriage to the dead weight he was leaving behind. As he reached the door, my gaze drifted past him, out onto the sprawling, manicured grounds of our estate. The early morning light was hitting the perimeter wall, and something caught my eye. It was a small, almost invisible flicker of movement near the tall wrought iron gate, an area usually deserted save for the security patrol at night. It was a bicycle. Not just any bike, a delivery courier's bike, parked awkwardly against the stone, and standing beside it, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with a wax stamp, was a figure too young to be an official courier, wearing a crisp, unfamiliar uniform. The figure wasn't looking at the gate. They were looking directly up at our second-story window, the window to the master suite, Mark's suite. And then Mark noticed something too. He stopped mid-stride, his hand hovering over the handle. He turned slowly back toward the dining room, his face suddenly drained of color, his confident posture visibly shrinking. "Who the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual command. He wasn't looking at the courier anymore. He was looking at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, genuine terror I hadn't seen since his first major career scandal a decade ago. The figure outside raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a deliberate, slow gesture. They pressed the envelope against the bars of the gate, leaned forward, and mouthed a single clear word across the distance. It wasn't directed at Mark. It was directed at me. The word was justice. Before I could even process the impossibility of the scene, Mark lunged, not toward the door, but toward the antique silver tea caddy on the sideboard, ripping the lid off with frantic force. He grabbed something small and metallic from inside, his eyes darting wildly between me and the figure outside. His face contorted in a silent plea that was instantly replaced by cold, hard realization. "You didn't tell me they were ready," he hissed, holding up whatever he'd pulled from the caddy. It looked like a flash drive. And then Mark did something utterly unthinkable. He threw himself backward directly into the massive antique grandfather clock, standing sentinel by the entrance hall, smashing the glass, his body collapsing awkwardly as the pendulum swung wildly, ticking furiously, counting down to something I couldn't name. The crash of the clock was deafening, a violent interruption to the morning's controlled devastation. The heavy oak case splintered, the face cracked like a spider's egg, and the rhythmic tick-tock that had measured our sterile existence for years gave way to a horrible, grinding silence, punctuated only by the frantic, uneven swing of the now broken mechanism. I remained frozen. Mark lay sprawled amidst the wreckage of glass and polished wood, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The small metallic object, the flash drive, had skittered across the marble floor, stopping inches from the toe of my slipper. My attention, however, was still drawn to the gate. The courier, the messenger of doom, was gone. The bicycle was gone. The oppressive silence had returned, thicker and more suffocating than before, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable next act. "Mark?" My voice, when it finally emerged, was a dry whisper. Useless Eleanor was finding her voice only when her tormentor lay apparently broken. The irony was breathtaking. He didn't answer. He only twitched, his eyes rolling back slightly. I pushed myself out of the chair, the movement stiff, protesting the sudden surge of adrenaline. I walked around the table, my movements slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. I wasn't rushing to help. I was approaching a specimen under observation. I knelt beside him. The scent of expensive cologne mingled with the sharp, metallic smell of blood blossoming near his temple, where he must have struck the clock's frame. "What was that, Mark? What did you throw?" I asked, my voice steadier now, infused with a strange, cold clarity. I reached for the flash drive, my fingers brushing the cool metal. Mark's eyes snapped open, wide and terrified, focusing on the drive in my hand. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle escaped. He clawed weakly at my wrist, not with aggression, but with the desperate pleading of a drowning man grasping at driftwood. "No, Eleanor, don't. They'll know," he managed, the words thick with panic. They? The faceless they associated with the courier and the ominous word, justice. I pulled my hand away gently. Know what, Mark? Know that I was useless? You made sure everyone knew that. I stood up, clutching the flash drive. It felt heavy, consequential. This small piece of plastic, whatever its contents, was clearly the tipping point. He hadn't thrown himself into the clock to escape me. He had thrown himself into it to hide something, or perhaps to prevent me from seeing whatever horrifying information this courier had delivered. The phone, my old, rarely used landline that sat dusty on the hall table, suddenly began to ring. It was an abrasive, archaic sound in the otherwise technologically advanced penthouse. Mark flinched violently at the noise, his body convulsing slightly. "Don't answer it," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Please, Eleanor, don't answer it." But I was already moving toward it. The silence had been broken. The facade had shattered. The city, Mark had mentioned, was watching. If that courier was an advance scout, perhaps the main event was calling. I lifted the receiver. The plastic felt strangely warm. "Hello?" For a moment there was only static, a high-pitched whine that vibrated unpleasantly against my ear. Then a voice cut through, crisp and professional, completely unlike the frantic whisperings of the city's elite I was used to hearing. "Mrs. Albright, this is Detective Reyes, Central Precinct." My blood turned to ice. Detective. Not a lawyer, not a competitor, but law enforcement. "Detective, I don't understand. My husband has had a fall." "We're aware of the situation at the residence, Mrs. Albright," the detective said smoothly. "But we aren't calling about Mr. Albright's minor accident. We're calling about the incident that occurred 12 hours ago on the 400 block of Silver Street." Silver Street. I remembered the news report vaguely. A major industrial fire, a chemical spill, significant environmental damage. Mark had been furious that morning, complaining about the stock dip related to the affected company. "I don't know anything about that, Detective. I've been here all morning." The detective paused, and I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard in the background. "We know you've been there, Mrs. Albright. But we also know you drove past that location at 3:17 a.m. this morning. And more importantly, we know what's on the encrypted drive you are currently holding in your left hand." My left hand. I looked down. The flash drive was indeed there, pressed hard against my palm, the heat from Mark's unconscious body transferring into the metal. How could they possibly know? The courier hadn't spoken a word to Mark, only to me. "Mrs. Albright," Reyes continued, his tone hardening, "we need you to remain calm. Do not attempt to leave the premises. We are dispatching a unit now. Do not let anyone else touch that drive. And whatever you do, do not plug that drive into any device." The line went dead. The silence returned, heavy with consequence. I looked down at Mark, his face pale and slack against the shards of the clock. He hadn't fallen because he was clumsy. He'd collapsed because he'd seen the messenger and known the game was over. He had tried to stop me from taking the drive, not to protect himself, but to stop me from accessing what was on it. I gripped the drive, the need to know suddenly overwhelming any rational fear of the police. I was useless. I had been labeled so for years. But if this drive held the key to why the city was suddenly aligning against Mark, perhaps now I could finally be something else. I walked quickly, silently, toward the hidden study, Mark's secret fortress. I knew the combination to the safe tucked behind the Rothko print, a combination I'd learned only because I'd once needed to find his will when he was sick with a high fever. I pulled open the heavy steel door, revealing not wills or deeds, but a sleek, unmarked laptop. My fingers trembled, but my resolve was granite. I ignored the detective's explicit warning. I ignored Mark's dying plea. I inserted the flash drive into the waiting port. The screen flickered. Instead of files or documents, a single application launched itself automatically. It was a customized interface, complex and deeply buried, filled with cascading green text that scrolled too fast to read. But at the top, illuminated in stark white against the digital darkness, was a single looping video file, labeled simply, Eleanor's Debut. And beneath the video title, a small progress bar began to fill, rapidly approaching 100%. It was playing. The police were en route. Mark was unconscious, and whatever Mark had hidden from me was now being broadcast directly to my screen, moments before the authorities kicked down my door. As the progress bar hit 99.9%, the video clicked into full screen, and the first image materialized. A grainy surveillance shot of me, standing in a dark room wearing a mask I'd never seen before, holding a wrench over the head of a man I recognized instantly, the CEO of the chemical company involved in the Silver Street fire. The image was sickeningly clear. Me, not the polished, silent Eleanor Albright, but a figure cloaked in shadow, an agent of chaos. The man beneath the wrench, Mr. Harrison, CEO of Omnichem, was frozen in a silent scream. My masked face was turned slightly toward the camera, but the angle was just enough to keep my identity obscured from anyone who didn't already know the precise curve of my jawline. The video played without sound, a silent, horrifying tableau of violence. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't environmental sabotage. This was targeted retribution. And somehow, impossibly, I was the perpetrator. The progress bar beneath the video vanished, replaced by a single ticking countdown timer. 0 hours, 5 minutes, 0 seconds. 5 minutes until the police breached the penthouse. 5 minutes to reconcile the ghost on the screen with the woman who couldn't even argue against a divorce petition. I snatched the drive out, the laptop screen reverting instantly to the blank, waiting desktop. I looked back at Mark. He hadn't moved. If he was breathing, it was barely perceptible. He hadn't been protecting himself when he urged me not to plug it in. He had been protecting the narrative he'd constructed around me. He needed me useless, compliant, and ignorant. My mind raced, connecting the impossibly distant dots. The courier, the one who had called me justice. The word wasn't a threat. It was an identifier. Useless, Mark had called me. But who had given me the skills, the access, the information necessary to pull off something like this? A memory flared, sharp and painful. The late nights in grad school, my research into corporate malfeasance masked as historical preservation projects, the academic circles where I'd learned about deep cover infiltration and psychological conditioning, skills I'd dismissed as fascinating, purely theoretical knowledge. Knowledge Mark had likely scoffed at, deeming it a charming hobby for his quiet wife. But someone else hadn't scoffed. Someone had utilized me. I heard it then, the distinct heavy sound of vehicles arriving outside the main service entrance, the one Mark used for his private elevator. They weren't being subtle. They were here. I looked at the flash drive in my hand. It was the evidence of my double life, the proof that I wasn't the damsel Mark had discarded, but a sleeper agent activated by a third party, the courier. My gaze fell on the phone, the receiver still resting off the hook, the open line to Detective Reyes. A terrible, liberating thought struck me. If the city was behind me, as the phantom messenger implied, then the police might not be here to arrest me for Harrison's attack. They might be here to enforce the other side of the equation. I picked up the receiver again, my hand steady now. Detective Reyes, this is Eleanor Albright. I need you to listen very carefully. I have the drive, yes, and I know why you're here. The static cleared immediately, as if Reyes had been waiting for me to call back. We are aware of the contents, Mrs. Albright. We have evidence linking Mr. Albright to significant payoffs intended to bury the Omnichem investigation. Mark. His downfall wasn't just about leaving me. It was about his own corruption being exposed by the very people he'd tried to silence. My uselessness had been his shield against scrutiny. He's down, I stated flatly, nodding toward the wreckage of the clock. He appears injured. Do not touch him, and do not attempt to clean up, Reyes commanded. Our field unit is 2 minutes out. They are under strict orders. Secure the scene, secure the evidence, and ensure the safety of the resident who cooperated. Cooperated? He meant the resident who was currently holding the proof of a massive corporate conspiracy and an act of vigilante justice. I moved to the tall, narrow window overlooking the atrium, the main public entrance. Peering through the thick, polarized glass, I saw the first signs of the raid. Uniformed officers, tactical gear glinting, were fanning out across the polished marble lobby below. But they weren't rushing the service elevator. They were converging on the main entrance, positioning themselves near the elevator banks that led directly up to Mark's floor. I turned back to the study, feeling the weight of 5 years of suppressed life crash down on me. I had 5 minutes. I couldn't stay here and wait for the police to decide which version of Eleanor Albright they were arresting, the scorned wife or the masked operative. I had to leave the board clear for the final move. I looked at the laptop, then at the drive, then down at the motionless body of the man who had underestimated me most profoundly. He thought I was useless. He thought I was nothing. I grabbed a heavy bronze letter opener from the desk. I wasn't going to hide anymore. Suddenly, the exterior door of the study, a heavy, soundproofed slab of oak, began to vibrate. Not kicked, not battered, but systematically examined. A precise, almost delicate series of metallic clicks followed, indicating someone was expertly bypassing the electronic lock Mark had installed after our last argument. It wasn't the police. The police knocked. This was too quiet, too skilled. The digital timer on the laptop flashed 0 hours, 1 minute, 30 seconds. The lock gave way with a soft thunk. The door swung inward just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness, and in that gap I saw not a badge, but the familiar shape of a slim black pistol being raised. "Eleanor Albright," a voice hissed from the doorway, a voice laced with a strange, familiar authority, utterly different from the police. "You should never have plugged that in. You've compromised the entire network." It wasn't the courier. It was someone else. Someone who knew about the drive, who knew about the network, and who was now pointing a weapon at the head of the newly awakened, useless wife. And as the figure stepped fully into the room, illuminated momentarily by the screen still displaying the masked image of my own face, I recognized the hard, cold eyes that had always haunted my periphery. Mark's primary corporate rival, the one who had supposedly been in Zurich for weeks, the man who stood to gain everything if both Mark and I were removed from the equation. The man who stepped into the study was Richard Vance. His tailored suit looked crisp even amidst the wreckage of my suddenly shattered reality, and the gun in his hand was steady, aimed directly at my sternum. His smile, usually too broad and ingratiating for the boardrooms, was now razor-thin and genuinely predatory. "Zurich, Richard? That was a weak cover story, even for Mark, I managed, my voice surprisingly steady, fueled by a cold, exhilarating rage that finally burned away the years of dormancy. I held the flash drive up, not as a shield, but as a trophy. Did you send the courier? Was that your signal to activate me? Vance chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Activate you? Eleanor, please. You flatter yourself. You were a fascinating long-term asset, certainly. The perfect invisible lever to destabilize Mark's entire operation. We just provided the gentle nudge to get the gears turning. The laptop timer blinked. 0 hours, 1 minute, 5 seconds. The tactical unit must have been seconds away from breaching the main elevator doors, alerted by the external noise of the street raid. But you were never supposed to access the primary feed, Vance continued, taking a calculated step forward, forcing me back against the built-in shelving unit. The bronze letter opener felt insignificant in my opposite hand. That footage, the Omnicam hit, that was Mark's leverage against me. He kept it as insurance. He knew I'd try to clean up his mess after he divorced you, but he didn't count on you being so curious. So Mark hadn't been entirely useless. He'd kept a secret weapon hidden, not against the world, but against his enemies, and, crucially, against me. He'd never trusted me enough to reveal his own enemies, but he'd trusted me enough to be his patsy, the convenient scapegoat for his own illegal insurance policy. And the courier? I pressed, stalling, tracking his muscle twitches, calculating the distance to the emergency panic button hidden beneath the desk. The courier, Vance sneered, was a distraction for Mark, a phantom threat to make him panic and destroy his own evidence before he could file those papers. But the message you received, that was confirmation. The system is engaged. You played your part beautifully, Eleanor. The distraught wife whose convenient silence is now proven to be elaborate staging. When the police find you standing over the body of your husband with the evidence of corporate sabotage in your hand, the narrative writes itself. He was right. The city was behind me in spirit, perhaps, but the legal apparatus was about to be firmly behind Mark's engineered downfall, and mine. 0 hours, 0 minutes, 40 seconds. The sounds of heavy boots pounding on metal echoed faintly from several floors below. They were close. Vance raised the pistol higher. Now hand over the drive, Eleanor. We can still spin this as you being coerced. A fragile woman forced into crime by a desperate husband. I can protect you. I looked from the gun to the laptop. If the video was playing, the evidence was propagating across the network Vance thought he controlled. If I gave him the drive, he could wipe the laptop, stop the spread, and control the only remaining physical proof. But if I didn't... "You think I'm fragile, Richard?" I asked, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. It was terrifying, unfamiliar, but utterly real. I've spent 15 years being called useless by a man who thought he owned me. I've spent those same years watching, learning, and waiting for someone, anyone, to give me a reason to stop being useful to him. I slammed the bronze letter opener down onto the laptop keyboard, not aiming for any specific key, but driving it downward with all my strength. The display screen shattered with a sharp crack, sparks showering briefly before the machine sputtered into blackness. Vance roared in frustration, momentarily flinching from the shower of debris, and his aim wavered by a fraction of an inch. That was all I needed. I didn't rush him. Instead, I pivoted violently, kicking the heavy leather chair directly into his knees. He stumbled backward with a grunt of surprise, the expensive leather squeaking under the impact, momentarily throwing off his balance. 00:00:0008. The timer was screaming silently now, a stark red digit in my mind. I didn't run toward the door. I ran toward the main wall of the study, specifically toward the ventilation unit built high above the doorframe, a unit I knew was wide enough for a person to squeeze through, a fact I learned while planning how to retrieve Mark's hidden ledger during an imaginary scenario years ago. Vance recovered instantly, steadying himself against the doorframe, regaining his focus. He tracked my movement and brought the gun back up, but I was already launching myself upward, using the thick oak shelving as a boost. "Don't move!" he yelled, his voice echoing in the confined space. I jammed my fingers into the grate of the ventilation unit, the metal tearing at my skin. I pulled hard, and the entire panel ripped loose with a screech of protesting metal, revealing the dark, dusty shaft beyond. 00:00:02. I squeezed my body sideways into the opening, the sharp edges of the shaft scraping my ribs. I could hear Vance behind me slamming his heavy frame against the wall beneath the vent, trying to reach me. 00:00:01. As my feet dangled just inside the darkness of the ductwork, Vance's hand shot up, missing my ankle by millimeters. He gripped the flash drive, which I had intentionally dropped onto the floor beneath the shelving unit, and pulled it free just as the tactical team breached the main study door with an explosive charge. The sound of the breach shook the entire building, but inside the metal shaft, it was muffled thunder. I flattened myself against the cool metal floor of the duct, heart hammering against my sternum. Then, through the chaos of the muffled shouting, I heard Vance's voice, no longer a hiss, but a bellow of triumph, amplified by the sound bouncing off the walls of the study. "Too late, Eleanor. The evidence is mine. I control the narrative." But Vance was shouting at the police, who were now flooding the study. He was holding the flash drive, yes, but he didn't realize that I hadn't just left the evidence behind. As I launched myself into the vent, I pressed the one thing I still controlled, the bronze letter opener, hard into the open cavity of the shattered laptop. The heavy metal shaft vibrated once more, and then, far below me, I heard the distinct high-pitched sound of a massive electrical surge, the sound of a short circuit followed by a plume of acrid smoke rising from the dead computer. Vance didn't see it. He was too busy showing the police the physical drive he'd just snatched up. But I knew. When I plunged the letter opener into the circuitry, I hadn't just destroyed the laptop, I had triggered the secondary emergency transmission protocol I'd spotted nested deep within the boot-up sequence of the operating system. The video wasn't just sent to Vance's network, it was sent everywhere else, simultaneously, using the laptop's last gasp of power to blast it onto every public broadcast frequency in the city, overriding the clean feed Vance thought he was salvaging. I crawled blindly forward into the darkness of the vent system, just as I heard a new voice, calm and authoritative, cutting through the police shouting from the study below. "Secure Vance. He is the primary suspect in the Harrison homicide and industrial sabotage." But Vance screamed back, his voice laced with panic. "It's a trap. She rigged the laptop. Check the open channels." A terrible rising wave of noise began to filter up through the ventilation grate near the outer wall. Not police sirens, but the sound of thousands of car horns blaring in unison from the streets below, accompanied by the unmistakable triumphant sound of a citywide news alert siren reaching a fever pitch, signaling that everyone was now watching. The cacophony rising from the streets below was overwhelming. It wasn't just sirens anymore, it was a genuine roar. The sound of a massive crowd galvanized, alerted, and unified. The city, which Mark had dismissed as a mere backdrop to his ambition, was now the stage for his undoing. I pressed my ear against the cold metal floor of the ventilation shaft, hearing the muffled chaos erupt in the study. Vance's panicked cries were being drowned out by the definitive, non-negotiable sound of the truth breaking through the controlled channels he and Mark had so carefully constructed. My lungs burned from the confined space, and dust coated my throat, but I didn't move. I listened for the distinct sound of the police taking Vance into custody, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs, the sound of a powerful man finally silenced. There was a brief, violent scuffle below, a thud, and then a gradual settling of volume. The tactical shouts subsided, replaced by the measured, professional tones of Detective Reyes. "Sir, secure the drive. We need to cross-reference his access logs immediately. Get forensics on that computer unit. See what that short circuit actually triggered." The information was out. The video, my masked persona enacting justice upon Harrison, was playing on every jumbotron, every television screen, every smartphone across the metropolis. But crucially, woven into the background noise of that same transmission, Reyes would soon discover the data packets I had seen flicker across the screen before the laptop died. Mark's meticulous records of bribes, shell corporations, and illegal environmental payoffs tied directly to the Omnichem disaster. Mark had tried to use my supposed uselessness as camouflage, believing he controlled both sides of the chessboard. He hired me to be the perfect wife. Vance activated me to be the perfect scapegoat. But in their arrogance, they both failed to recognize that the foundation of the structure they were trying to burn down, me, had spent 15 years studying their blueprints. I waited in the suffocating darkness for what felt like an eternity, listening to the rhythmic pounding of the city's pulse return to normal, albeit a new normal. I listened until I heard a new set of footsteps approaching the study door. Slower, more measured than the tactical entry. The study door opened again, and this time I heard Reyes's voice, closer now, speaking with an undertone of respect, not aggression. "We need to secure the second resident," Reyes stated clearly. "Mrs. Albright, we know you are in the ventilation system, ma'am. We are not here to harm you. In fact, your quick thinking prevented Mr. Vance from destroying critical evidence linking Mr. Albright to organized corruption." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "We need to know who activated you, Eleanor, and we need to know about Mr. Harrison. We found the wrench. We found your fingerprints on the handle. But we also found encrypted communications between you and Mr. Albright's offshore accounts detailing payments you received after the incident, which suggests you were operating under his direction, or at least his coercion. He was offering me an out, a narrative where I was the coerced victim, the pawn. The city was indeed behind me, but the law still needed a neat explanation. I pushed myself further into the ductwork, crawling towards the exterior access panel, a location I knew led to a rarely used maintenance ledge on the west side of the building, completely shielded from the main lobby where the police had gathered. "Detective Reyes," I called out, my voice raspy but clear, projecting down the shaft toward the study below. "I am not coming down that way." "Why not, Mrs. Albright?" "We have secured the threat. Vance is detained." "Because the narrative you want is too clean, Detective," I replied, my voice echoing eerily in the metal tube. "I wasn't coerced. I wasn't paid off after. I was simply waiting for the right opportunity to stop being useless." I reached the panel. It was secured with heavy-duty screws, but I had the letter opener, now bent and stained, but still a wedge. "The man on the video," I continued, wrenching at the panel, ignoring the protests of my muscles. He deserved what he got. Mark deserved what he got. They both underestimated the cost of making me quiet. With a final, desperate heave, the screws tore free from the cheap metal frame, and the maintenance panel swung open onto the cold, crisp morning air, revealing a dizzying 300-foot drop to the busy street below. "I'm not going back inside to be questioned about coercion, Detective," I said, clinging to the ledge, the wind immediately whipping my hair across my face. "But I will leave you this." I reached into my pocket, pulling out the heavy, distinctive wedding band Mark had forced me to wear for 15 years. I didn't look down at the streets teeming with reporters and onlookers who were now watching the live feeds of the tower's exterior. I dropped the ring. It caught the sunlight for a brief, dazzling moment before plummeting toward the chaos below. "Tell the city," I whispered to the wind, letting go of the letter opener, which tumbled after the ring, that Eleanor Albright is no longer his wife, and she is no longer anyone's support system. I hauled myself onto the narrow stone ledge, the cold biting through my thin silk pajamas. The police below shouted my name, demanding I return, but I only looked up toward the high, jagged peaks of the financial district towers that surrounded our penthouse, their glass facades reflecting the fierce, rising sun. I took one last breath of the air that had once felt so stifling, and then I began to climb, moving not toward the ground, but laterally across the facade, disappearing into the architectural shadows, leaving behind the wreckage of the marriage, the shattered clock, the detained rivals, and the stunned silence of the city that, finally, knew exactly who I was.